Hello, and welcome to week 4. Today is Ministry in Diverse Muslim Contexts. Um, the Muslim world today is made up of about, depending on the numbers used, 1.6, some people say it's maybe 1.8 billion people, the majority of which live in that band that come from West Africa through the Middle East and into South Asia. Through that region, there are about 3,000 distinct languages and cultures, and of course, not all of those are Muslim, but a lot of them are. Not only that, but millions of Muslims also live outside of what are the traditional Islamic world in places like Europe and North America. With this kind of staggering diversity, how does one meaningfully prepare themselves for something in the means of practical ministry to Muslims? Well, the method I've rejected is one that focuses entirely and exclusively on things like you looked at last week, that's studying classic Islamic texts. Answering Islam by Gisler and Salib, it was a great text, used to be used in this course. But the problem with an excellent text like that, or many other great ones out there, is they share a common weakness. And that is they approach Muslims as if they were all a monolithic block, that were all the same because they all follow the same religion. So consequently, most learning about Muslims that missionaries go through tends to focus on things like we did last week, like the study of the Quran and the 5 pillars, and maybe you learn some hadiths, okay? The kinds of things that fit in neat religious categories. But too often, that ends up with a portrait of Muslims that they themselves wouldn't recognize in many parts of the world. Even with the best of intentions, missionaries sometimes create, through that kind of learning, training, and thinking, an understanding of Islam and the people of Islam that's very different from on-the-ground realities. For many people, it's hard to understand because we're just so naturally default to hard and fast boundaries because that's how we were taught all the way since elementary school. In our earliest years, we were trained to look at a map and think, okay, here's Texas over here, and across that line's Mexico. That works great for introducing children to reading maps, but such hard boundaries are less and less useful the closer we get to real lived human experience. And that's the kind of places where authentic human mission, where Christian mission takes place, not in abstractions like geopolitical boundaries. For example, if you look at Texas and it shows the Hispanic population of a map of Texas, it shows the Hispanic population county by county. You will see that along the border, especially in the southern part of that border with Mexico, most of the counties have a high percentage of Hispanics living in them. In fact, most of those counties along the border have 90% or more Hispanic population. Sure, they're legally in Texas. They're legally a part of the United States. But when you go there, they're going to feel a lot more like being in Mexico. I mean, I have friends that live down there. They were missionaries in Mexico for a long time, and they said there's not a store in their area that isn't at least bilingual, and many of them there's no English spoken in at all. Now, this points to the reason for our lesson this week being constructed the way it is. In order to really understand mission in the Muslim world, in a huge section of the Muslim world, we need something other than a formal religious category to think about the people we're going to be reaching, to think about from the perspective of their lived experience. That's why this week we're turning our attention away from Orthodox Islam, if you will, and looking at some of the many ways that Muslims actually live out their lives, particularly those who live outside the heartlands of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, most of us like to think in terms of hard boundaries because they clearly establish categories that we already know, like who's Buddhist as opposed to who's an atheist, or who's Muslim rather than who's Hindu. But in assuming these clear categories, we sacrifice a significant degree of accuracy and a depth of human experience. The religious boundaries that seem so precise when you read them in a book just don't work well when it's boots on the ground in mission. That's because biblically based ministry is not about engaging the religion of Islam. It's about engaging the people who follow it, the people who call themselves Muslims. We've already talked about that distinction. Therefore, a more missiological way of thinking about people in many parts of the quote, Muslim world is more like looking at the edges of a wheat field, is how I like to think about it, what they call the margin. It's a ragged, uneven place where many plants grow together. The wheat seeds are there. They were planted by the by the sewing machines, but also other plants have crept in and they're mixed together, the wheat crop with all kinds of wild plants. Then it's just not clear where the wheat field ends and where the wild, bushes begin. I think that's a better way of thinking about religious blocks, like Muslims, or even we could say the same thing for Hindus as well. But I think that's a better way of thinking about religious blocks than the geopolitical boundaries between countries, where colors on a map tell you where one ends and one begins. Of course, seeing people through the lens of formal Islam is not completely opposed to seeing them through a lens of them being Muslims. But they have different points of reference. You think about it this way. The first one focuses on doctrine and scripture, the elements that comprise the orthodox core of Islam or of that faith. Okay. In contrast, thinking through the lens of people focuses on the behaviors, worldview of people who call themselves Muslims, who say they're submitted to Allah. In theory, these two are supposed to be the same, the formal doctrines of a religion reflected through the lives of its practitioners. But yet, if you've been around churches for very long, you know that even in Christianity, there can be a big difference between what people are supposed to believe and then what they really believe, in that they live out their lives doesn't always reflect what they believe. And your readings this week are going to show you that there's a very significant difference between the formal doctrines of Islam and the living practice of many Muslims in parts of the world today. In fact, I would say in the majority of the Muslim world today, but that's a whole other thing. Of course, there are many places in the world where Islamic orthodoxy is the norm. This is most common in the Arab-speaking Middle East and North Africa. It has something to do with the language of the Quran being the language they speak every day. With them having easy access to the Quran, because the Quran is only supposed to be written in Arabic. If you don't read Arabic, that's a problem. Okay. These contexts are where classic Islamic studies are crucial to the task of developing good missiology. Okay. And that's why we looked at it last week. We looked at classic Islam and the doctrines of Islam. Okay. But now we're moving away from that center to the edges, to where people don't really think in those same categories. And Islam, the official doctrines of Islam, are mixed with all kinds of other things, as you'll see this week in your readings. This space we are calling the margins of Islam. It's the place where people mix and match Islam with other kinds of beliefs, maybe the beliefs they had that were there before Islam came often, and they do it without even realizing it. Okay. The readings this week will allow you to explore some of these margins, I've called them, not because these ones in the book are particularly special, but because they're representative of the diversity that's across the Muslim world. Each chapter will help you see some of this concept through a different lens, a different location. However, there are several common themes that are woven into every chapter, all designed to help you kind of think about this collectively. You're going to see what we call thick description of each context. That means a really deep description of the way people live there. You're going to see an exploration of commonalities that the context shares with classical Islam. You're going to see a description of ways the context is very different from classical Islam. You're going to see specific ways the context influences development and mission strategy, and you're going to find reflection questions as well. I should close by saying you're exactly who I had in mind when I first came up with the idea for this book many years ago. I wanted to draw together insights from many different missionaries, people who had spent years working in different parts of the Muslim world, so they could help readers understand some of the ways that Muslims live out their lives beyond the borders of religious orthodoxy. And so, like my intention was with the book, my intention is for this week of the class that this week's readings would open insights into the Muslim world for you, and perhaps even call some of you into it, but with a better informed understanding of what the people who follow the Prophet Muhammad are like, rather than just what they're supposed to be like and what they're supposed to believe. Please remember my Zoom room is open every Thursday from 10 to 11 Central Time. And I am easy to reach if some other time, if that doesn't work, some other time you need to set up a meeting with me. Please let me know if I can help you in any way, and I hope to see you sometime soon. God bless you.